So one very common theme about criticisms of Natlan's story is that the characters aren't as fleshed out or they're more shallow compared to previous regions, specifically Fontaine and Sumeru. I'm just using these tweets as examples of what I'm talking about, not necessarily that there's anything wrong with these tweets, so please forgive me if you find offense at that. So not meaty, not MDI, dim. You probably know this person, or you at least know of their tweets. They say, my opinion on Natlan is that it has a great Archon quest, awesome music, world quest, exploration is as fun as usual, but they failed on one crucial aspect, characters. If I think about Fontaine characters, I miss them. They made me care heavily for them. Natlan, nothing at all. So I'm using this tweet as an example because I think this is actually a pretty good tweet of identifying what the problem is, which is that the Natlan Archon quest itself is actually technically speaking, or more if you want to put it in a more cynical manner, it's like clinically speaking, Natlan story quest in terms of how it's being executed, there's nothing actually technically wrong with it, which is what I find so baffling about a lot of the criticisms, because a lot of people are criticizing it, in my opinion, in a very vague way. They don't actually identify what the actual problem is. If you were to ask them what is like one thing wrong, they will say something like, well, I didn't like how this character ended up. I don't like how much there's fluff, how much unnecessary stuff there is in it, or I don't like this or that, but it's not very specific. But not dim identifies something that is pretty much endemic to all of the criticism, which is that they don't really like the characters. They don't really feel like the characters are doing anything for them. And this is repeated by, comments or tweets with less likes. It's just all over the place, right? There are a lot of the comments that basically say the exact same thing. I literally just missed Fontaine all of it. We could have just stayed in Fontaine for one more version. I wouldn't have been mad. Natlan characters, for the most part, just feel like regular people without interesting backstories. Even their story quests aren't about them, which is actually very on point, because the Archon quests, and I would say, like, yes, the story quests, they're not even called story quests anymore, right? There are actual, there are two primary types of story quests in Genshin Impact. It's very confusing if you're not into Genshin Impact. There's like the Archon quest, which is like the main story, and then there's like the interlude, which is kind of part of the Archon quest, and then there are the story quests, which are not very intuitively actually just the character story quests. So the story quests are actually supposed to be about the characters, and one of the main complaints about Genshin Impact so far is that a lot of the story quests aren't actually about the characters. They're actually about the NPCs that the characters are helping. And part of this phenomenon is the theory that Genshin Impact is actually not about the playable characters, aka the vision holders. I don't know what the specific term for it is, but in Chinese it's like the vision holders are basically the god seeds. So one of the theories is that the god seeds, there's like a very strange English name for it, which is supposed to translate into Genshin or Yunshin in Chinese or Japanese, but they've screwed it up, and so nobody actually knows what Genshin is in English. But the god seeds, aka the primordial god, the Genshin, are supposed to be the vision holders. And so the vision holders, the theory is that the vision holders actually become gods by helping the people of Teyvat, and that is basically the whole meta story behind Teyvat. So it kind of makes sense why the characters would help the NPCs more than anything else. But the side effect of that is that it doesn't actually focus on the characters. That is just one theory for why so many of the stories have to do with actually just helping the NPCs. And Natlan in particular takes this up to a notch, up to like a degree that is, in my opinion, not seen before. And I think honestly Natlan does it better than all the other regions, because the Archon quest actually takes into account the world quest and the tribal quest that you do, which are like the equivalent of the story quest, right? So just the fact that they're called tribal quests kind of implies that there aren't really story quests in which like the focus should be on the characters. So it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to me why people are complaining about this. There are literally no character story quests. They're called tribal quests. And so you have character story quests like Shalonan's, where the point is to help the NPC, the Psycho Mother, not really help her, but help her daughter or her adoptive daughter get away from her control. And then you have Kenichi's story quest, where he doesn't really even feature that much, and we're supposed to help Kangamato stop himself from hurting other people. And then you have Mualani's tribal quest, which is probably the worst one in my opinion, but it was also to figure out like what the mysterious island actually is, and to help the people understand like why the mysterious island is actually just their own island. So there's a lot of roundabout ways of characterization in Natlan, in my opinion, that don't actually follow through on characterizing the characters. But even this kind of thought process, in my opinion, is a little weird because it's like it assumes a lot of people who criticize Natlan assume that the purpose is to characterize the characters themselves, which I would go even a bit farther here. I think Dim identifies something really. He or she, they don't really say it directly, but I think one of the things that is missing in this entire conversation is their purpose even to characterize the characters, right? They are called tribal quests, right? So why would you assume that the purpose will be to characterize the characters? And that's just the entire thing about all these criticism that I want to hone in on, right? I want to focus on why are they not focusing on the characters? And if you look at a bunch of the other tweets right here, somebody says, I get it, but in both Sumeru, so let's go upwards a little bit. So these people are talking about the lore, right? I see your point, though this is less character driven, has been exactly why I really like the Natlan storyline. It was extremely lore heavy, the kind of lore dump we'd usually only get during Dainsleif Mondstadt appearances. And I think this wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And then there's a reply, I get it, but in both Sumeru and Fontaine, we had really big lore drops. But still, the characters were still central and deeply important overall. One doesn't have to exclude the other. And then you have another reply, I know what you mean, but I feel like the lore we get in Sumeru was fundamentally different than the one in Natlan, and with a huge part of the lore drop, this patch being about struggling, defeating fate, it only made sense to me that this would be a struggle of Natlan as a whole. And that's just the thing, right? You have two people here pointing out different things. For example, Sumeru and Fontaine obviously had lore drops, but I would argue that the lore drops in previous regions were not as direct, they were not as hands-on, they're not as like actually present in the lore of the story, in the actual events of the story that is happening. I don't think that is true for Natlan. I feel like a lot of the things that are discussed in the lore, for example, the heroes from the previous ages, the different the different Saurians, basically all of the things that are actually talked about. For example, even Ochcon, right? You go to Ochcon in Natlan, and then you do the quest over there, and you figure out who the fuck Ochcon actually is, and the Sage of the Secret Flame and the father. I don't know what the actual name is. It's like Waxa something. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name, but basically the lizard guy's name. And you actually see these people in the actual quest, right? They're actually still alive, or I assume he is. So the point I want to make is that why are all of these things so present? Why are they so relevant to what is actually happening in Natlan at the point in which we actually enter Natlan? It's because they have to make these things actually matter now, right? One of the reasons why there is less focus on the characters is because all of the things that have been previously revealed in previous regions, for example, all of these lore drops that this person is talking about in Sumeru and Fontaine, they don't actually have to have them happen in the actual story. So there is more room allowed for character interactions, there is more room allowed for character moments, because the lore is in the backdrop. The lore really only exists to give contextualization to the characters' experiences and the events surrounding the characters. But in Natlan, it's kind of reverse. It's kind of like the characters are there so that the lore can actually happen, so that the events that the lore actually talks about can have some sort of appearance in the real story, right? I think this guy talks about it. It was extremely lore heavy, the kind of lore dump we'd usually only get. And this is really relevant because Dainsleif's story quest is sort of like a stand-in for the actual like main story of Genshin Impact at this point. A lot of the times people complain that the main story, aka the Archon quest in the actual regions, for example, Fontaine and Sumeru, don't really progress the story that much. And that has kind of been reversed in Natlan. It feels like Natlan's story is the main story at this point because we are actually doing the things that progress the main story at this point. We are actually fighting in the abyss. We are actually interacting with things, for example, entities like the Renova, like the Shades, and like just the abyss in general that have been hinted at from very, very early on, as early as the Inazuma Archon quest. So the difference is that the lore actually, this time, actually matters. It's not just something that you would read in a book or in a text somewhere, and then it just never, you don't have to think about it ever again. And there are more tweets, I think, over here. I think a lot of nation-specific discourse happens because people forget that Genshin is not actually about the inner workings of each region. It is a 7-year-long story about celestial tyranny and the consequences of a heavenly empire. And I'm not saying that this tweet is like 100% right or that I agree with it. I just like it because I think it points out the fact that Genshin Impact, even though we have this like nation by nation format, right? We have this Tevat format of 7 nations, 1 per year. or at least ever since Inazuma, we get one nation per year. They don't actually exist in a standalone story, each unto themselves. It's not like we can just keep on going with, oh, after Conry, after Natlan, we have Snezhna, and then it's over, right? Even now, even with Snezhna, we're kind of already breaking the pattern already. We're going to Not Cry for 6.0. I'm sorry, it's not like, is it really a leak at this point? Can I just say it? We're going to Not Cry for 6.0. Can we just say it, please? There's enough hints at this point, right? So we're already breaking the format of one nation per year. We're going to get Snezhna with potentially 2 years per region for the last region of Teyvat, and I think that's a good thing in my personal opinion. I don't know why people are so against it unless you just hate Snezhna. I don't hate Snezhna. I'm pretty excited to have 2 regions for Snezhna. So the reason why this is breaking, I think there's like the very cynical reason is that they just don't want to leave Teyvat. And so they're lengthening the story with one extra region for Snezhna. But now that I think about it a little bit more, I think you could optimistically say that they understand the problem with Natlan. They understand that to make the lore, the things that we have read actually matter, they have to necessarily make the characters take a bit of a step back. There's not going to be as much room for characterization because things that are relevant to the lore actually have to happen rather than, all these interpersonal relationships happening in the foreground. So what I suspect that they might do is that they might just split up not Natlan but Snezhna into 2 parts so that we have even more time to have both. We can have the lore important things actually happening, while at the same time we can have these character moments that people who are maybe not as into the lore can attach themselves to, so that they can actually give a shit about Snezhna, unlike Natlan. So that is my optimistic take for why we are going to not cry first. But I must also say that some of the things that have also been revealed about Nockride, especially the fact that there are going to be multiple powers, having representations of their interests there, which I assume to be an implied representation of each of the different nations that we have been to, and the possibility that we might actually go back to each of the different nations. I think this could be either a good thing or a bad thing. I think what this means is that possibly we might have a story that is centered around not just one core cast of characters, but multiple casts of characters from each of the different regions that we have been to in the past. And this could be like a very good, best of just kind of like we go back and have a good time with all the previous characters we got to know. And so we don't have to introduce all these new characters that people may or may not care about. We can have, John Lee appear again. We can have the Raiden Shogun appear again. We can have all these characters we used to care about. And I think that could be a very good thing. Or we could just have less focus on each of these different characters, and then nobody cares about any of these individual characters. They could just introduce an entire new cast of characters for Nodcry, and then each of them don't get as much time because we go to each different nation, and maybe like only one character accompanies us to one of these different nations. I'm talking about, like, obviously there are still places in previous regions that need like regional expansions. So I'm just speculating that maybe for Nodcry, it'll be kind of like a worldwide tour of some kind before we go to Snezhna itself. And there's going to be like some kind of invasion arc regarding Snezhnaya. I'm getting really ahead of myself, but basically what I'm saying is that it might be a good thing that we actually split Snezhna into 2 parts, and this is a possibility for increased characterization as well as decreased characterization of the new characters. Personally, I might be okay with them just introducing one new 5-star per patch, like perpetually for all of 6.0, if only to give more room to like the older characters that we have come to care about, and give them potentially more characterization than they used in the past, because let's be honest, a lot of the characters in Liu, a lot of the characters in Mondstadt, they're kind of a one-note character. There's not really that much to them in their story quests. I did Jin's story quest, I did Ganyu's story quest. They weren't that great compared to the modern ones. What if we could get like a second story quest for Jin or a second story quest for Ganyu? That would be awesome, in my opinion, if we got to, revisit these nations again for the main story. So that is just my thought process on, where the main story is going. But there's 2 fundamental competing motives for how story writing is going here, right? You have to have the important things actually happening, and you also have to have characterization. And this is where these 2 like fundamental differences are coming to a head now in Natlan, because the story is actually ending for Teyvat. I've already talked about this in the past, where Teyvat, because Teyvat's story is ending, at least this portion of Genshin's Impact story is ending. I don't think there will ever be like characterization on the same level as Fontaine or Sumeru again, because there's just not enough like a content or time for them to do that. I'm sorry, I just think that's going to be the way it is. And I don't think this is going to be like a thing that is fundamentally wrong with the writing. It's just that the mode of the writing is different. And that is why I have such a big problem with like so many of the criticisms here, because I'm showing the criticisms that I do like, but a lot of the criticisms simply just don't understand that the writers are trying to do something different, and the motive of the writing is different from what it was in the past. They can't spend like 3 or 4 acts just on Farina's inner workings and their emotions, because they can't do that they just can't do that for Natlan. They actually have to have the fight happen. They actually have to have all these other NPCs have their lines. It's just a different way of how things work. Moving on. The problem with Natlan is that it broke conventions. That's why it felt different and a bit weird. Genshin usually tells the story where it can be speculated on. So it holds you through patches as you try and predict what may happen. Good thing to have in a gacha. Now, I find this tweet interesting because this is not my conception of Genshin Impact. I'll be honest. I started all the way back in 1.1. And to be perfectly frank, the early stories were not like this. I think it only became like this. It only came to head, like the culmination of this thought process, this conceptualization of Genshin Impact as like this big mystery, where you work up, from Act 1 to Act 5, and all these little hints that they give you from Act 1, 2, 3, 4, all of that culminates into one big act in Act 5. And then you have this like epiphany where everything comes together and you solve the big mystery, and the entire Archon quest is like, oh my god, everything is tied together. And I suddenly understand why this character is behaving all weird. They were just secretly a really good guy or suffering for 500 years. That sort of stuff. That was not it for Mondstadt. That was not what Liria was like. And arguably, that was also not what Raiden Shogun was like. All of these stories that, frankly, people like less, even though like they're more than half of the nations that have been revealed right now, when you go from like Mondstadt all the way to Sumeru and Fontaine, 3 out of the 5 nations prior to Natlan were not actually like what this person is talking about. It's really only being Sumeru and Fontaine. And what's interesting to me is that because so many people have come into Genshin Impact and so many people have left Genshin Impact, I suspect that what is happening now is that most of the people who have stayed on Genshin are the ones who have like come onto the Genshin ship since Sumeru and Fontaine, right? The game has grown a lot. The game has lost a lot of players. So the idea of Genshin Impact has changed pretty drastically, in my opinion, since the start of the game. When I first started the game, I thought this was like an action-adventure game. This was like a Chinese Breath of the Wild Zelda clone. And I thought there was going to be a bunch of dungeons and a bunch of like puzzles and really cool, action combat. That was what was missing, in my opinion, with Breath of the Wild. And it didn't really turn out to be like that. It turned out to be more of like a visual novel the more the game went on. I didn't know what gacha games were at the time. So it kind of makes sense that the game went that way. However, that really was not how I felt about the game when the game first came out. And for me, for example, because my conceptualization of Genshin Impact is so different, I actually feel like Natlan is sort of a return, or at least a reversion to what Genshin was like more so in Inazuma. I'm not saying that Genshin Impact in Natlan doesn't have a lot of dialogue, that it doesn't have a lot of different like characterization moments or something like that. But they are definitely not on the same level as Sumeru and Fontaine. It's pretty much going back to the way that Inazuma was, except with a 5-act. I think it's basically just upgraded Inazuma. I've seen a bunch of tweets. I've actually seen a couple of tweets and a couple of Reddit posts where people compare Natlan's story to Inazuma. And I think it's actually pretty apt, because there's this whole war arc, and people have said that the war that as it was done in 5.1 or 5.2, no, it was 5.1, was actually somewhat like what they imagined the war between Watatsumi and Inazuma Island was going to be like. So it's obviously a bit more action-packed. It's definitely less mysterious. And yeah, I just don't think... I think that at this point, Genshin Impact is just so old that any major change... Even Natlan, I feel like there weren't really that many major changes made in Natlan in the storytelling compared to For example, the upgrade between Inazuma and Sumeru, where it went from 3x to 5x. I actually felt like that was a bigger difference in the change in storytelling because they were just giving way more room. But apparently, if you just focus a bit less on characters, then everybody freaks out and everybody's unhappy, and now you have to like maybe revert back to a little bit more to back the way the people are familiar with Fontaine and Sumeru, maybe in Nodcry. So maybe that will happen, but it's just very interesting to me that everybody's conceptualization and their perspective and their image of Genshin Impact is so vastly different. For me, this was supposed to be mostly an action adventure game with like really deep lore and some really good storytelling. But I'll be honest, I really didn't really give a shit about Genshin's story all the way from Mondstadt all the way to Liyue's End. None of that stuff I didn't give a shit about when I actually played those stories. It wasn't until the second Zhongli story quest where I was like, wow, this game is way deeper than I thought it was. And then Inazuma like completely wrecked my expectations. I was like, holy shit, this game is shit again. This game's story doesn't matter. So the idea that Genshin Impact is this super deep, well-told story in the Archon quest is actually a fairly new thing. It's only being a thing since Sumeru, to be honest. It's only being the last two regions. Like if you accept the idea that Natlan is a bad Archon quest, that means that 4 out of the 6 Archon quests are shit. Let's be honest. 4 out of 6, that's more than half. That's 2/3 of the Archon quests. That's Mondstadt, that's Inazuma, that's Liyue, that's Natlan, and it's only Sumeru and Fontaine that weren't shit. So I don't know. Maybe it's not as maybe the idea that Sumeru is maybe the idea that Genshin Impact is like this big, complex, super well-told story game is not as much of the case as you might think. And then here, I was reading Ashkai's update on what she's been doing lately and what the future is. And one thing that really stood out to me was her note on Genshin Impact. Right? If you just read this summary, this paragraph right here, this was the one that stood out to me. If you've noticed a decrease in Genshin content, I'm not calling out on Ashka on anything. This is nothing like that, but it's just this one paragraph here, as you can see in front of you. If you've noticed a decrease in Genshin content over the last couple of patches, it's because I'm a little burnt out on Genshin. Natlan has been fun and the quests have been good, but a lot of stuff in them feels like it should have been drip fed to us over the last 2 years rather than packed into 4 patches. And this is a really interesting line because a lot of people feel like Natlan is really honing in. It feels very reminiscent of the earlier conversation between these tweets on the lore. Why is the lore of Natlan so different? It's because it's becoming more relevant. I think this is what Ashka is really getting to. I'm not trying to read into her thoughts or anything, but it does feel like there are so many things going like a bang, 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 new lore, all the time, that you really don't have the time to keep up. Everything's changing per patch. There's this lore is actually relevant. This lore changes everything you knew about the game. This lore changes everything you knew about Genshin Impact. Because all of these things are coming to a head now in Natlan, right? So by the time, she says, I feel like I have a good grasp on stuff. There's 10 more things that drop and I'm tired, and that puts a big damper on my motivation level. So yeah, I totally understand what she's talking about. It's just how are you supposed to keep up with all this if you're covering 3 games? It's unrealistic. So if you're going to go nuts and say, well, why are you shitting on Ashka? I'm not. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying that this actually kind of gels with what the earlier conversation about the lore is talking about. The lore of Natlan is different from Sumeru and Fontaine. It's much more impactful. I don't know if that's kind of insulting Sumeru and Fontaine lore. That's not what I'm saying. But it definitely feels like if the things that were revealed in Natlan were revealed in the last 4 years, they would have been way more they would have been super deep lore drops, each of which would have warranted a completely new video. But suddenly all of this stuff is bang, 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 bang. All of it is being revealed in Natlan. And I have to wonder if this is because they know that Teyvat's story is ending. It probably almost definitely is. It's probably because they know that they have to get all this shit out now. That's why there is less characterization specifically for this reason. And yeah, that's basically it. I'm just saying that for those of you who are criticizing Natlan's story, and for those of you who are wondering why you like the story, It's probably because of this. The people who like the lore, who are into like more lore or plot driven, so you say like just things happening, events happening without as much contextualization around the character's motivations. For example, me, I don't really need to have like these deep relationships, or like I don't need to get into the heads of the characters as much to enjoy a story. And for those who do, this must be like the worst thing in the world. This is why Natlan is still divisive, because as much as I like the characters, right? Genshin Impact's world building and the world itself is ultimately what I'm interested in. It's like I enjoy the world of Genshin Impact through the characters, whereas for a lot of other people, they enjoy the world of Genshin Impact because of the characters. If that makes any sense. For them, the world of Genshin Impact is the characters, but whereas for me, it's more like the lore, the world building, and how all of this fits into like a grand scheme of some sort. I hope that makes a little bit more sense, and why there is such a divisive opinion on how Natlan has been told. I'm not saying there aren't problems with Natlan storytelling, in particular, like the way that Capitano's death worked out. I think there needed to be more time with Capitano, and I think there needed to be more explanation for how Renova accepted or did not accept Capitano's death. But in general, I don't think that it was bad storytelling or even bad writing that people have a problem with. They were just saying it's that because they don't have, better words similar to me, or they don't understand why things are happening the way they are. They don't understand that Natlan is like the worlds that Genshin Impact have created in each nation. They're not really distinct from each other. It's not like we're not actually going to a new nation and they're all completely separated from each other. And each new nation is just, a way for you to get to know the characters. You might want it to be that way, but Genshin Impact's story is bigger than Teyvat, and Teyvat is just one piece of the pie, and each nation is also a piece of that puzzle piece of that pie. And all of that pie has to come together now. And that's happening in Natlan. And unfortunately, maybe the pepperoni on each piece of the pizza is not as good as the other piece of the pizza, if that makes any sense. God, I suck at allegories. Or is it metaphors? I don't know. This is Bench Gamer signing out. I'll see you guys later. Bye.